Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese, and we'll be exploring what resilience means to our communities in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfire, and now even pandemics. In this episode, we'll discuss the social and economic benefits of preserving our older, vulnerable building stock, making sure they protect their most precious contents, the people who live, work, go to school, and conduct business in them, as well as the critical functions they provide for their owners, tenants, and the community. Recapping from our first episode, structural engineering experts talked about the limited objectives of building codes, how they are developed over time, and why our ability to make buildings safe and earthquake resistant evolves over time.
When we have major events, there are changes that come because we learn from earthquakes every time something happens. We update the codes and with new lessons learned.
In any city like San Francisco or Los Angeles, 80 to 90% of the building stock was built before our modern codes were developed over the past, say, 30 years.
Many of those were built in the 50s and 60s, maybe into the 70s. What we do today in the building codes should take care of all of the problems in those older structures.
But for many known vulnerable older building types, we can't count on the things we take for granted in modern structures, like prevention of collapse and repairability, and protection from loss of use or even loss of life. The occurrence of the next big earthquake, or hurricane, flood, or wildfire is not a matter of if, but when. We don't have to look too far into the past to see how entire cities can be devastated when buildings fail. The twin earthquakes in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2010 and 2011 are case in point.
That caused a tremendous amount of damage and disruption to the city. 70% of the buildings in the central business district had to be demolished after the earthquake.
The retrofits you'll learn about vary from large manufacturing facilities to historic properties that anchor neighborhood character and revitalization, to preservation of multifamily housing. What they have in common are significant economic, safety, and social benefits. To begin, AnheuserBusch is one of the most well-known brands in the world. It built a large brewery in Van Nuys, California back in 1954. Like most large structures of the time, it was constructed of heavy concrete walls and floors that lacked ductile reinforcing. In the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, the brewery was heavily damaged and production was halted, allowing its competitors to cut deeply into its market share. Anheuser-Busch took action in the early 1980s to prevent a repeat experience when the next large earthquake inevitably happened. But they didn't do things haphazardly. Anheuser-Busch spent $11 million to retrofit its vulnerable buildings. This was less than 1% of the replacement cost of the brewery, worth nearly $1.3 billion at the time. It wasn't long before that investment paid off. The epicenter of the 1994 Northridge earthquake was only a few miles from the Van Nuys brewery and caused significant shaking. Many buildings collapsed at sites near the brewery, but none of the Anheuser-Busch retrofitted buildings suffered any significant damage. After minor cleanup, the brewery was restored to full operations in less than a week. This time around, they lost no market share to their competitors, and were even able to produce cans of water to provide free to the community. Anheuser-Busch estimated that had they not retrofitted their buildings, the cost would have exceeded $750 million in property and business losses. Lance Hastings, president of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association, praised the project.
A lot of machinery is involved there to get the beer into the bottles or the cans, and they've been able to get ahead of the curve and plan against current and future events, and really to be applauded.
It might be tempting for owners of vulnerable types of older buildings to think that ignorance is bliss, that if they haven't been specifically told by an engineer or a building department that their building is vulnerable, they'll be free from liability when the earthquake occurs. Others may believe that if a city does have an ordinance that requires them to retrofit but gives them, say, 15 years to comply, they have no liability before the deadline is up. Those beliefs are not supported by the facts, and that misunderstanding can not only cost lives, it can financially ruin a business owner. I spoke with Madison Spock, a Southern California attorney, about the legal liability that owners of vulnerable buildings may face.
If you have a restaurant or you own any premises where there's a condition that might be dangerous to people who enter onto the premises, then you have a duty to make those premises safe for them.
Are there examples that you can think of where owners were caught unawares and paid a price for not taking proactive steps to retrofit their buildings?
There was a case that came out of the December 22nd, 2003 Paso Robles, from Paso Robles in the San Simeon earthquake, where it's a perfect example of what you're asking about. Acorn Building, the owner of that building had dates that had been projected. The city projected dates way out into the future. And the owner had a very dangerous building but had not put into it the necessary work in order to make sure that the building had come into compliance. So the question is, what did that owner need to do? Could that owner just sit back? The answer to that from the court was no, absolutely not. Because when the San Simeon earthquake hit at 11 in the morning, two of the workers, a young woman who was home and was about to start her college career, and a woman 55 who had just gotten her daughter off to school and just gotten her daughter into school, they both tried to flee the building, and as they were fleeing the building, it actually collapsed on the two women. And those two women were the two lives that were lost, tragically, in the San Simeon earthquake.
I assume the same would translate into a city even if it had no ordinances, because the fact that some building types are vulnerable is now common knowledge, where maybe that wasn't the case a few decades ago.
An absolutely excellent point, Evan, an excellent point, because even if the city has chosen not to act for whatever reason and not to impose its own, and let's assume for some reason that a state ordinance doesn't apply, it doesn't mean that the law of general negligence doesn't apply, because the law of general negligence always applies to such conditions.
What about in some cities that haven't required retrofits, but say they've required owners of unreinforced masonry structures, for example, to put a plaque on the building? It says, "This is a potentially dangerous unreinforced masonry structure." Can posting a warning alone absolve the owner from liability?
It's unlikely that the plaque would be sufficient for a simple reason. No one knows when an incredibly large seismic event is going to occur. When you enter the building under those circumstances, there is simply no way that you can protect yourself from a seismic event. If the building begins to collapse, and it collapses because of the condition of the building, you don't have a way to protect yourself in the same way you do as when you walk across a slippery floor.
Madison, what would be the first piece of advice that you'd give a business or building owner trying to decide whether they should be concerned and investigate, or whether they can just sort of try and avoid the issue?
My first advice would be, don't talk to your lawyer. Talk to your engineer. Talk to your architect. Talk to someone who can tell you what the condition of the building is. Because a lawyer can walk through your building and say, I think that's a problem, let's set up a committee and let's do step by step something that plays well. Ultimately, if you have to go to trial on that issue, if you said, well, I went to a lawyer and I set up a nice little plan, there's not much better evidence that a plaintiff's lawyer could have of those circumstances. Get to a structural engineer, to an architect, to an expert who can identify potentially dangerous conditions on the property and can identify what the remedies are for mitigating that possible problem, and someone who knows what amount of money it takes to fix it, because surprisingly, a lot of retrofitting is not as expensive as people think. It can often be done at a very reasonable price.
One example of an owner who recognized their responsibilities to bring older buildings into compliance with modern building codes for safety, and who enhanced the neighborhood by preserving local character, was Optimum Seismic, the developer of the Weinman Building in San Luis Obispo, California. Craig Smith, the project architect, spoke about the building, the challenges and adaptive reuse of the historic structure, and how the developer's concerns about liability led them to seismically retrofit the structure.
And the Weinman Hotel building was built in 1932. It was considered at that time a contributing hospitality development, because the mission was here and they were trying to elevate tourism. And it was derelict for probably close to 25, almost 30 years. The building was found to have a number of idiosyncrasies, if not uniqueness, in both its character and the need to adaptively reconstruct it to be both seismically correct and everything all current legal buildings would have to have.
Ali Sahabi is the co-founder of Optimum Seismic. Ali, why did you consider such an old building with known seismic deficiencies a worthwhile investment?
The Weinman building was a hotel that stopped operating as a hotel and became depleted, and it was a large enough building that you could create a mixed use project where you have commercial on the first floor and residential on the second floor. As we all know, for the last several decades, affordable housing and lack of new housing, production of new housing has been an issue here in California. So part of the economics of that building was the city was very, very much interested in creating some additional rental units, which is what we were able to do at Weinman by introducing 48 units of residential on top of this very prime commercial corner.
Ali, how do you measure the success of this project?
Number one, it's the economics. As a developer, as an investor, we want to make sure that we're getting the return on our investment. And with that, we want to make sure that our building, the end result is desirable. If we have residential users, or if we have retail or any other commercial type of uses, as long as we have tenants that want to be there. That's our number one way of measuring the result. Second is most of these buildings are unique. They're located in downtowns and a special old part of towns with character, and it represents the pride of the community. So when the building looks good, when the building looks like the way it was originally was meant to be built 100 years ago or 120 years ago, it means a lot to the community. They take pride in it. Most of these renovation projects are really close collaboration of the three disciplines of architects, structural engineers, and contractors. When you're dealing with an existing building structure, when you start drawing the plans for as-built or you start designing the solutions, really all you're doing is based on what you know at the time. And it's almost certain that it's going to change once you start these projects. And that's when the architect and engineers get involved again with the construction trades. They need to come up with the solution as the project is going on. Alternative ways of retrofitting, either to make sure that we are meeting the intent of the historical preservation and at the same time the intent of the structural integrity of the retrofitting and the design.
We've seen the tragic outcomes that can occur when cities don't adopt modern building codes or mitigate their existing vulnerabilities. One of the clearest examples of the opportunities and challenges that come with renovating and retrofitting older buildings are historic structures.
Hi, my name is Linda Dishman, and I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Conservancy. Historic buildings provide a touchstone, a place where people know where they are, and people become very attached, both in their neighborhood and in the city at large, of buildings where they've had a particularly happy memory, or something happened in their lives, or something historic happened there that they associate with. One of the things we've learned is that proactive action does make a difference. In terms of retrofitting buildings, when the city of Los Angeles did Division 88 to retrofit all of the unreinforced masonry buildings and required property owners to do that, they did it. And when the Northridge earthquake happened, there was no loss of life from an unreinforced masonry building, because all the buildings had been made safe in terms of the actual event itself.
Retrofitting older buildings to bring them into compliance with modern engineering standards of safety when the structure is historic can be particularly challenging. and on the more expensive side among different types of seismic retrofits. But it can dramatically improve and revitalize whole neighborhoods and downtowns, bringing in business and spurring other owners to improve their own buildings. Another example of such a project was the renovation of the Society Hotel in downtown Portland, Oregon. I discussed the project with Jonathan Cohen, one of the building's developers.
Our building in Portland, Oregon is a really interesting one. It was built in 1880, kind of a safe place for sailors, kind of like a YMCA. It operated for about 10 years until 1901, when they sold it to Japanese family, Japanese Americans. The area had become New Japantown. A small tong or fraternal organization, Chinese fraternal organization, purchased our building in 1944, but the last event was really held in 1952, and then after that the building sat dormant on the upper floors until we purchased it in 2013.
What made this a worthwhile investment for you?
I think to take on a project like this, you have to be passionate about it. I also love old buildings, and I love the stories, and I love being able to reimagine them for a new future, new ways to use them, and new people to experience them with all the modern amenities that we expect in newer buildings. It needed a completely new structural system, completely new mechanical, electrical, plumbing system, fire suppression, and a fire life safety system. So a gut rehab while basically maintaining the entire interior structure and almost all of the materials. We really saved about 95% of all materials in the building and either removed them and replaced them or left them in place.
Now, I'm assuming you went into this with eyes wide open. You knew because you have experience that a building this old was going to take some significant work. Was it necessary to do a seismic upgrade too?
Yeah, there were multiple triggers in working through the permitting process with the city of Portland that sort of corralled us into a required seismic upgrade. We selected a really excellent structural engineer who both myself and my other partners have worked with many times on other projects and had a lot of experience working with and upgrading, doing seismic retrofits for older buildings. The other critical design criteria that we learned very early on, because we were also going with placing this building on the National Historic Register, was that the state historic representative let us know that they would not accept an internal brace frame style construction for shear resistance. So we would be forced to use cast in place concrete walls for our shear resistance all the way up through the building.
Jonathan, in a historic property retrofit, there can be additional restrictions and requirements, and you and I both know that means costs. Were there any kinds of financial incentives that either the city or federal or state governments offered you to help foot the bill for the seismic retrofit and other work?
The short answer is no. And that's not for lack of trying. It's a real barrier to why there's not more of our buildings that are prepared for resilience in Portland.
You know, when an existing building, an older building like this, is made more resilient and preserved, a lot of people benefit. Lending institutions, insurers on the property, they all benefit too. Jonathan, what kinds of incentives would have been meaningful to you and made this process easier?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the answer in the current environment is just cash. It could be preferable loan terms or a really favorable loan to assist with that. And we need some real policymakers above the level of administrative folks at the planning agencies to support this.
The U.S. Resiliency Council was really pleased in 2019 to award the Society Hotel and 3 other 100-year-old Portland properties that had also undergone significant retrofit silver ratings, meaning they are essentially similar to modern code buildings. What did that mean to you to receive that rating for the building?
Well, it's really a wonderful accolade, and we're very much appreciative of the recognition of our project. We, as I mentioned earlier, it's a passion project for me and my wife, and we care very much about preserving this building and telling its story. And resiliency and thinking long-term about the survival of this building is the way that we're going to be able to keep doing that. So to be recognized for that is very nice.
So how do you think the renovation of the Society Hotel helped to revitalize that old Chinatown neighborhood?
It's a real catalyst project for the neighborhood, I believe, because as I mentioned earlier, there are many, many other buildings of its vintage in the neighborhood which have not been upgraded yet, and they would like to. And I think our project provides real guidance for a way that that can be done. And after we completed our project, dozens of buildings transacted, sold, and some were renovated. And one right around the corner did a similar renovation, and we're very proud of that. And we'd love to see as many of the buildings in Old Town be preserved as possible.
It might seem like the engineering challenges that come with retrofitting older or historic structures are daunting, but Linda Dishman notes that often creative solutions are available and accessible.
Retrofitting historic buildings has come such a long way since, we first started doing this, in the 70s and 80s. And at that point, it was a very intrusive system with lots of steel that was inserted into spaces. So you felt safe because you could see all of the structure. Engineers have done an amazing job at really pushing the envelope and finding new technologies to make these buildings secure and not have it be so intrusive into decorated spaces. We're big fans of adaptive reuse because sometimes uses change. And also there's the sustainability factor, is that reusing these buildings means they're not going to the dump, and that we're able to reuse that. It's much more that, the saying is the greenest building is the one that's already built.
What about preserving and protecting our existing affordable housing supply from earthquake damage?
Starting to look now at how do we preserve existing affordable housing, because the feeling is you can't build your way out of an affordable housing crisis. And so particularly if you keep losing affordable housing to build market rate.
We learned in this episode that up to 90% of the building stock in our cities was designed and built prior to the development of more modern codes. Each time a natural disaster occurs, we learn about what went right and what didn't. Structural engineers take this information, coupled with advances in science and technology, and gradually update our building codes to improve the safety and functionality of our buildings. Codes address both new construction and, importantly, standards for how to most cost-effectively retrofit known weaknesses in older buildings. Importantly, though, cities have to adopt approved codes, and not all cities keep up. The current state of awareness about vulnerable building types means anywhere earthquakes are a known problem, owners with older buildings are leaving themselves exposed to legal liability risk, even if they have not explicitly been told that their buildings may be hazardous. We've heard from developers that have taken on historic and adaptive reuse renovations and reaped the business rewards, public gratitude, and personal satisfaction of preserving the past and contributing to an exciting future for their communities. Working with expert engineers who are employing new technologies and the latest science is key to achieving these results cost-effectively, and we'll explore this more in future episodes. Next time on The Resilience Advantage, we'll consider the connections between the environmental sustainability movement, green design, and disaster resilience. In order for our businesses and communities to be truly sustainable in the light of natural hazards that are increasing due to climate change, we must not only build green, reducing our impact on the environment, but also resiliently, where the environment has a low impact on us. Thank you for watching, and please join us next time on The Resilience Advantage.